In July of 1939, Dietrich Bonhoeffer returned home to Germany. Just months before, he was called up to serve in the German army, but could avoid the call because he was going to pastor a church of German speakers in America. However, as Germany looked destined to plunge itself into yet another big war, and as the Nazis had completely watered down the teachings of the German church, Bonhoeffer couldn't bear to be on the sidelines. Bonhoeffer knew that a war would leave Hitler completely unhinged, and that if the persecution of Jews was bad before, it would only get a whole lot worse as Hitler felt he had nothing to lose. As he returned home, he was adamant that there would be no sidelining him this time. Despite being a committed pacifist, Bonhoeffer entered German military intelligence. And with some of his closest allies deeply perplexed and some even considering him a sellout, only Bonhoeffer and a handful of others knew his true mission: killing Adolf Hitler.
Hello there.
So we finally reached a video where we're covering Nazi Germany, and so let me know in the comment section below which of these Nazis do you find the most evil? Goebbels, Himmler, Heydrich or Hitler? So Bonhoeffer was born back when Kaiser Wilhelm was the Emperor of Germany in 1906 in a town called Breslau. His family was pretty well off and quite well connected, as we'll see later in the video, and Bonhoeffer was brought up to pray to God and read the Bible. Yet his family weren't active members of any particular church. And though well off, Bonhoeffer's childhood wasn't without hardship, losing two of his older brothers in the First World War. And so growing up with an intrigue in the Bible, and also with a deep sense of his own mortality, Bonhoeffer chose to study theology, and as part of his studies, he spent a year abroad in Rome. Now remember, Bonhoeffer didn't grow up going to church, and so his understanding of Christianity was fairly individualized, which is one of the tendencies that the Roman Catholic Church often criticizes Protestants for. But while in Rome, Bonhoeffer laid witness not only to the Sistine Chapel, but to the community amongst Catholics taking the Mass, and for the first time he felt he began to understand the role of the church. Having viewed Christianity as merely a matter between God and the believer, Bonhoeffer came to understand Christianity to also be a matter of fellowship between believers who all belonged as children to the same God. For Bonhoeffer, children weren't just to have a relationship with their parents, but also with their brothers and sisters. And so he began to appreciate that it was the same way in the kingdom of God. Bonhoeffer returned from Rome encouraged by what he saw from the Catholic Church, but with a different theology to theirs. He studied at Berlin University under a guy called Karl Barth. Basically, he's considered one of the greatest theologians of the modern era. But by Karl Barth's own admission, he didn't really say too much that was new, but rather voiced support for the teaching of John Calvin, who 400 years earlier supported the Protestant Reformation on the basis that the Catholic Church taught that people could be saved by God's grace plus works, rather than by grace alone. So if you followed those 3 degrees of separation, basically the TLDR is that Bonhoeffer returned home from Germany encouraged by the Catholic Church, but not necessarily in agreement with them. He then went on to pastor in Barcelona and went to study more theology in New York. Now, the education at Union Theological School was a huge letdown. It was basically like teaching someone who's capable of trigonometry how to do their times tables. But Bonhoeffer loved doing church with the Nego spirituals in Haarlem. As he watched them sing and as he saw them come to church with enthusiasm, he saw people who genuinely behaved in a way that matched the fact that they were saved from death itself. And so Bonhoeffer returned to Germany as a pastor. But as you can imagine, the landscape of Germany was changing quite dramatically as the Nazis came to power in 1933. Now, Hitler certainly described himself as a Christian, but he didn't really believe the actual tenets of Christianity, such as Jesus dying on the cross. Instead, he had a Nazified view of Jesus, and even as far back as 1922, 11 years before they came to power, he described Jesus as the greatest Aryan hero. And so as Hitler came to power, the National German Church, which would later be called the Reich Church, made a few changes to traditional church teachings. For example, Bibles couldn't be in churches, there were no crucifixes allowed or saints for the Catholic Church, Mein Kampf had to be placed on the altars, the cross was to be replaced by the swastika, and the Old Testament was to be abolished entirely. So why did they do all of this? Well, they wanted to eliminate 2 components from the Christian message. Firstly, that it came out of Judaism because from their eyes they would corrupt the whole religion, and secondly, to get rid of the cross because it symbolized weakness through sacrifice rather than strength through conquest. For the Reich Church, Jesus was a Nordic anti-Semite who preached the Aryan message and was killed by evil Jews for doing so. And this Reich Church was to be led by a guy called Ludwig Müller, and after Müller was appointed, the Reich Church added the Aryan paragraph to its code of beliefs, which basically forbade ethnic Jews from joining the church. Naturally, the Christians who believed the Bible didn't agree with any of this, and Bonhoeffer led the resistance with the Pastors' Emergency League. Now, it's worth saying that the majority of churches actually joined the Reich Church, and less than a third would actually join Bonhoeffer's resistance, but they did have 3 conditions for joining. Number 1, your ultimate loyalty was to be to the Bible and not the Nazis. Number 2, you agreed to give money to victims of Nazi violence. And number 3, you rejected the Aryan paragraph which prohibited Jews from churches. And so this league became known as the Confessing Church, and they wrote their inaugural confession, the Barmen Declaration. Now, from this point, Bonhoeffer actually left Germany for London and pastored a German-speaking church in London. His new nemesis, Muller, gave the approval for Bonhoeffer leaving because he thought it would silence a dangerous voice. However, it actually had the opposite effect, as Britain's freedom of speech actually allowed Bonhoeffer to be far more critical about the Reich Church than what he could have gotten away with in Germany. But Bonhoeffer would ultimately leave London and return to Germany in an effort to raise future German pastors to stand against the Reich Church. He set up an illegal seminary in this part of Germany called Finkenwalde, and from here, Bonhoeffer would train the students to preach and pastor, and he even took them on a trip to Sweden. Now, this trip to Sweden proved especially dangerous as they received media coverage, causing Ludwig Muller to find out about the seminary. Now, Muller blasted Bonhoeffer as an enemy of the state, and Bonhoeffer lost his title as a professor at the University of Berlin. Things then got worse for Dietrich. The Gestapo cracked down on the confessing church, arresting prominent pastor Martin Niemöller. It banned any sort of prayer books in churches, and then ultimately closed down Finkenwalde. But Bonhoeffer wasn't to be deterred, and he established a system of what was called collective pastorates. Instead of a training seminary, young ministry students would be paired in a master-Padawan-style relationship with existing reputable pastors within the confessing church. It was also at this point that Bonhoeffer wrote one of his most famous works, The Cost of Discipleship, which, as the name suggests, is a book where Bonhoeffer argues that being a Christian shouldn't be something that's cushy and comfortable, but actually requires costly obedience. And so, unsurprisingly, Bonhoeffer became high on the Gestapo's watch list. So why didn't they just arrest him? Well, Bonhoeffer was considered harder to arrest for two reasons. Firstly, he was actually pretty well connected and he had a brother-in-law and uncle in military intelligence. And secondly, he was internationally recognised, and in pre-war Germany, the Nazis had no intention of inviting international scrutiny. And so in 1938, the Gestapo arrested Bonhoeffer to rough him up and forbade him from going to Berlin. Then in 1939, Hitler ordered that all churches swear an oath of allegiance to him. Unsurprisingly, the Reich Church had no issues doing this, but surprisingly, there were a number of pastors in the confessing church who also did this. For them, they had bigger fish to fry and weren't going to die on that particular hill. That decision looked especially foolish just a couple of months later though, as Hitler invaded Poland and started ghettoizing Jews in the name of their hero, Martin Luther. If you haven't, you should definitely check out this video here where I explain Martin Luther's comments on the Jews. And so in 1939, Bonhoeffer returned from America, deciding that it wasn't the time to leave Germany, and he directed his efforts into the Great Conspiracy, killing Adolf Hitler. And so to get the Gestapo off his back, he got his brother-in-law, Hans von der Hanye, to hire him into the military intelligence unit. Bonhoeffer told the unit that him being a pastor was merely a cover story, and that he was actually pro-Hitler. Understandably, this confused his allies who couldn't be told the truth. For example, when Bonhoeffer went to Switzerland to gain support for a coup, his Swiss mentor, Barth, couldn't understand why Bonhoeffer would flee rather than pass through his city through the crisis. And while working for military intelligence, Bonhoeffer wrote another notable work called Life Together, where he argued for the importance of a Christian community unified in its pursuit of Christ. He also got engaged to a woman named Maria, but in his great excitement, he received bad news. His brother-in-law Hans gave him the news that the Gestapo was watching him and that an arrest would be imminent. Now, the Nazis made the mistake of thinking that Bonhoeffer was naive. After all, for them, the cross was a symbol of weakness. However, Bonhoeffer was no fool, and he left a bunch of false leads to throw the Gestapo off. When the Gestapo eventually did come, he was taken to Tegel military prison, but was actually pretty well looked after because of his uncle, Paul von Haas, who was high up in military intelligence. Now, while in prison, Bonhoeffer would write letters out, but knowing the Gestapo were reading them, he'd write out in code. Basically, he'd underline letters in his message, and when those letters were arranged backwards, it would form the message he'd really intend to send. And so, writing in code, Bonhoeffer got in contact with the assistant of Klaus von Stauffenberg, the guy Tom Cruise famously portrayed in the movie Valkyrie for trying to assassinate Hitler. The July 20th plot was basically an attempt to kill Hitler by bombing his wolf's lair. Now, the bomb was planted and exploded all as planned. It killed Hitler's stenographer instantly, but Hitler himself was protected by the table leg. Obviously, Hitler put his foot down from here. Over 7,000 people were arrested and 5,000 were executed. Von Haus was hanged on the same day as the plot, and von Stauffenberg was executed by firing squad. The Gestapo then took over Tegel military prison and actually sent Bonhoeffer to Buchenwald concentration camp. And from Buchenwald, Bonhoeffer was then transported to Flossenburg extermination camp. Now, this was on the 3rd of April, and the Americans actually liberated Buchenwald just 9 days later, on the 12th. After initially being sent away, Bonhoeffer was taken back to Flossenburg, where he was stripped naked and hanged, almost certainly at the orders of Hitler himself. And there's a number of tragic elements to this story. The Americans liberated Flossenburg just 2 weeks later on April the 23rd, and those closest to him, including his fiancée Maria, had actually heard that Bonhoeffer was alive and didn't actually find out that he died until a month and a half later, well after the Nazi surrender. But Bonhoeffer didn't see his own story as tragic. The Flossenburg doctor remarked, "In the 50 years of being a doctor, I've never seen a man die so entirely submissive to the will of God." For Bonhoeffer, his death entirely proved Paul's claims in Philippians to be true. To live is Christ, and to die is gain. Thanks for watching. If you did like this video, make sure to leave a like so that YouTube knows that this is content actually worth watching. We can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.